Hello. Today we're going to be talking about implementing SIP trunks using the Mitel MiVoice Business system. So before we get started, I think it's a good idea to talk about exactly what a SIP trunk is. So a SIP trunk is basically a connection between one business and another, and it's used to send calls from one business to another. You can kind of consider SIP trunks as being very similar in function as a highway, where cars are traveling down over the highway, voice calls will be sent out over this SIP trunk from one point to another. Now, while it's totally possible that two different businesses can have a direct SIP trunk between them, normally businesses will connect themselves to their internet service provider, and the ISP is responsible for getting those calls from one business to another, or from one source to the destination. One of the most important questions to ask is, why would someone opt to implement SIP trunks? Well, there's a few different reasons, but the primary reason for implementing SIP trunks is in the cost savings that you see with using SIP trunks versus older legacy style connections. So these older digital or analog trunks are going to require not only very specific physical connections, but also very specific physical hardware that will allow for calls to be understood at the destination and sent out over a given link. SIP trunks, on the other hand, utilize pre-existing data infrastructure to establish and manage those connections. So rather than basically having two totally separate networks within your business, one that's used very specifically for voice traffic and the other used for standard data traffic, implementing SIP trunks can allow you to converge those different types of traffic onto a singular network. So the standard router, switches, and Ethernet connections that are used for data traffic can now also be used for voice traffic. I did mention that you have, with older legacy style protocols, digital and analog, that there's very specific hardware and physical connections that are needed. It's becoming harder and harder nowadays to find actual replacement parts and maintenance parts for this specialized hardware, simply because the world is simply moving more towards a very converged style network. When it comes to actually implementing SIP trunks on the MiVoice Business system, there are a few different areas of configuration we have to look at. And the first and most basic area is the network elements form within the MiVoice Business system. So within the network elements form, there's a few different areas, a few different fields that have to be configured. There are three, maybe four key ones that we'll take a look at here. So the first is the network element name. This is pretty standard, and you're going to want to simply name the network element after wherever your destination is. Obviously, in this example, we're simply using SIP here, but in the production environment or in the real environment, you're going to want to be a little more descriptive with your names. The next field down, the type, this is also very important, as it's going to be really the only type that's applicable when we're creating SIP trunks. The other selections within type are for different types of network elements. Other is perfectly fine for SIP trunks. The next field down, the FQDN or IP address, I don't think either of those need any sort of introduction. In order for the MiVoice Business system to be able to send a call to some sort of destination, we have to know what that destination's FQDN or IP address is, and this is where we would configure that information. The last field within this form that we're going to mention here is the SIP peer, and this is absolutely critical because without this flag checked, we will not be able to define other very specific SIP connection details within the MiVoice Business system. So once we have SIP peer checked here, the next thing that we're going to be taking a look at is this list of fields here will populate or will show up when SIP peer is selected. Now, All of the different fields that have shown up here are generally going to work just fine with the default values, but there are two in particular that I did want to highlight, and that is the SIP peer transport and SIP peer port that are listed here. These two particular values must match whatever is expected at the far end. So if the far end is expecting traffic on port 5065 and they wanted to send over the transport protocol of TCP, it is very important that that information is entered here. If it's not entered, what will happen is calls will not establish because the far end is expecting traffic on a very specific port on a very specific transport protocol. And if it doesn't get it, it won't understand that that's what the traffic is utilizing. So it's really important that your transport and port match whatever is expected at the far end. Really important. Once we have our network element details defined, the next thing that we're going to take a look at is the trunk attributes form, which, as we can see here on the left-hand screenshot, is going to be underneath trunks and then trunk attributes. So what we're going to have once we select our trunk service number here is a list of non-protocol specific configuration that needs to be enabled. Really important to note that whatever trunk service number you select here, you're going to want to make note of it because there will be a point on the next step where we have to link the next step to these pieces of configuration. So it's really important to note down your trunk service number. As far as other fields on this page that need to be configured, you need to make sure that your call recognition service setting is enabled correctly, and what CRS controls is basically the experience of anyone who is coming in using this trunk as an external hot desk user. So with the setting that we currently have here listed as trusted, external hot desk users that come in over this trunk will simply be able to come in and they will automatically log in and then be able to make whatever their call is. Using one of the other options available within the CRS field here will change what that process could look like. In some cases, the external hot desk user may need to enter in their DN and their PIN number. In other cases, they may only need to enter in their PIN, or as I just described with the trusted configuration that we've selected, they will simply log in automatically. So that's all going to be dependent on what experience you want your external hot desk users to have. The next field down, direct inward dialing. So this is a field that controls whether or not DID calls will be accepted on this particular trunk. If you have implemented DID services, meaning that your users are able to be dialed externally, the DID service needs to be enabled on at least one of your trunks, if not multiple trunks. And then the last field that we'll talk about here underneath trunk attributes is the class of service field. So for those of you who watched our previous video on class of service, this is going to basically be a list of advanced calling features that are available to an element assigned to a given class of service. In this case, we've assigned class of service 55, so that would indicate that class of service 55 is the SIP trunk class of service list. So that's, again, something very important that needs to be set up. So the last bit of configuration that is needed very specifically for a SIP trunk to function is what's called the SIP peer profile. So we previously created a network element for our SIP destination. The peer profile is going to basically act as a collection point for all of the other configuration that we've entered. So we're going to define a name or a label for this peer profile. We're then going to associate this peer profile with a specific network element. That was the very first step that we did. And then the last bit of configuration here is the trunk service. So the previous step, we defined or we selected a particular trunk service number, and then we added in all of the non-protocol specific attributes or values that will be used for a given trunk. The trunk service number that we define here is what's going to link the previous step to all of the other configuration that we've added. So the SIP peer profile is basically going to be used by the rest of the MiVoice Business system to identify all of the particular specific configuration details that we've entered and that will be used for a given SIP trunk. You'll notice along the top here that there are several tabs of configuration that can be entered. These aren't required for demonstration purposes. Following through with these steps, a basic SIP trunk will work for you. However, if the destination that you're defining this SIP trunk for has specific interoperability requirements, it is very likely that you will find those requirements or those options within the Peer Profiles tabs. The last bit of configuration that I'll quickly touch on, it goes a little bit beyond the scope of talking about SIP trunks specifically. However, when you have a SIP trunk defined and you've got all of the configuration added, the last sort of step that you can use to allow the system to actually make use of that newly defined SIP trunk is to create your ARS dial plan and set up your SIP trunk as one of the ARS routes for that dial plan. In our example here, we've chosen ARS route 8. We've defined the type of traffic that is going to be sent over this particular route. In this case, we're selecting a SIP trunk, and then we're telling the MiVoice Business system which SIP peer profile is going to be used for this particular destination. So once you've got your dial plan created, you attach one of the ARS digits dialed to an ARS route. The ARS route, in turn, in our example here, is attached into the SIP trunk that we just finished creating. So putting kind of all of this together, a SIP trunk basically functions as a highway connection between your local business and some remote or different business. The MiVoice Business system itself will utilize basically three key areas of configuration: the network elements, the trunk attributes, and the SIP peer profile, all together in order to define the destination of where calls leaving your local system over a SIP trunk is going to be sent. I'd like to thank everyone for their time today, and we will see you in the next video.